by expelling 50 Russian officials accredited as diplomats, presumably intelligence officers. And it had started a bit of a quarrel with China, first of all by putting the latest Taiwan request for arms at the very top of the agenda, as if it was, a burning issue, even though it concerns the delivery of weapon systems that will not be ready for years. To quarrel with Russia could make sense. To quarrel with China might make sense. To quarrel on the issue of North Korea might also make sense. But one doesn't do this all at once, because good relations with Beijing mean leverage on Moscow. Good relations with Russians mean leverage on China. If you quarrel with both at the same time, you're just driving them in each other's arms. As for North Korea, the Chinese have given us problems on all kinds of issues, but they've been very cooperative with North Korea.
Now, does this seem to you like a particularly bellicose stand on the part of the U.S. government?
No. It is the accidental result of officials quarreling with each other. Officials newly appointed, each of them with a lot of experience, each of them perfectly capable of running a good foreign policy all by themselves, must now work together. And they have different views, and they treat Russia, China, and Korea as balls that they throw at each other. Colin Powell, our Secretary of State, announces that he views Korean detente with favor and looks forward to pushing it further. So Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, who's under great pressure because her position is threatened by the expansion of Vice President Cheney's roles, decides to take a much harder line position. Condoleezza Rice would be fine running foreign policy by herself. Colin Powell would be fine. Cheney could do it. Rumsfeld is, more than qualified.
Well, now, this is not the first administration in which officials have disagreed. Why is this becoming so public at this point?
Well, first of all, divergent, contradictory statements made in public were a matter of record, which appeared in the same issue of the newspaper. The problem is that they have to form a team. So why didn't we have these problems in the past? Well, I think for two reasons. First, there was a Cold War to discipline us all. Secondly, past presidents took charge. President Bush, his style of leadership is a rather relaxed style of leadership, maybe to some degree passive, and he doesn't exert strong leadership.
Now, let me ask you about two other areas that are significant concerns of the United States at this point, the Middle East and the Balkans. How do you evaluate the way in which the new administration is handling those two areas?
The visit of Prime Minister Sharon to Washington was attended by perfectly consistent, non-contradictory statements by the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and so on. And what the President himself said was consistent with what all his officials said. So this problem does not exist in regard to the Israeli issue. It does exist in regard to the Iraq issue, where again, Secretary of State Powell said we want to narrow the sanctions, but on weapons we're going to be more effective by having more officials at the borders. And the answer from the Pentagon was, oh no, we can't change the embargo, and so on and so forth. There was public disagreement, once again. Now, in regard to the Balkans, there were statements made during the campaign which reflected positions that many Europeans do not like, but which are American positions. We are concerned about the Balkans, yes, but we do not want to send more troops.
Former Reagan administration official Edward Luttwak is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He spoke with us from Cologne, Germany. Patrick Cronin, Director of Research at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, says there is concern in many quarters about the new administration's somewhat rocky start in the foreign policy field. But Mr. Cronin says he sees no long-term prospects of reviving the atmosphere of the Cold War.
I don't hear Cold War rhetoric out of the top officials of the Bush administration. I think we definitely hear some rumblings on the sidelines from the conservative press and others that harken back to the Cold War days and which puts forth very hardline unilateralist positions that don't sound very compromising in this early 21st century. Right now, we see a lot of unease about whether or not the new U.S. administration is going down a path of unilateralism and stirring up the pot of those major power centers, at the same time perhaps neglecting the developing world.
Mr. Cronin says he shares some of Mr. Luttbach's concerns that the United States may be alienating the Chinese and the Russians simultaneously, and thereby pushing them together.
There's certainly some enduring lessons of history, and among them, one is you never want to fight a multi-front war if you don't have to. And I think Edward Luttbach was onto something when he said that early steps by the Bush administration seemed to be pushing a number of countries into concert against the United States. For instance, Russia may be on the verge of selling strategic weapons to China. That is a relationship, Moscow and Beijing, that has to be very uncomfortable by dint of their own history and interest, and yet the fact that the United States could be prompting Moscow to do something that's contradictory to its interests seems that maybe we are overplaying our power hand. I think the Bush administration will get this right. I think that Secretary Powell will be a moderate voice of the administration and will prevail among the den of voices being heard right now during this transition. And you'll see the United States active in areas where it maybe wasn't so active in the past. For instance, this past week, Secretary Powell encouraging prospects for a negotiated settlement between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Mr. Cronin says he thinks President Bush is more interested in foreign policy issues than his relative lack of experience might seem to suggest.
I think clearly he is going to learn a great deal during his first couple of years as president and will probably feel far more comfortable conducting international diplomacy than he does now. But he does have Vice President Dick Cheney, a man of great experience in international security affairs, and he has truly experienced veterans in key policy positions such as Colin Powell, at Deputy Secretary of State Rich Armitage. The extent to which I see some lassitude in the Bush administration approach to international affairs, I think it's probably driven more by the inevitable result of a slow transition process that occurs every 4 to 8 years in Washington. You know, the idea that the Bush administration is not eager to jump into facilitating a peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, or eager to pick up on a near-missile deal with North Korea, shouldn't be read as a sign that the Bush administration will not be more interested in those issues and others 6 months from now. I'm more optimistic than many of the critics, but these are very serious issues. I don't belittle their concerns. I think their concerns can be helpful and can remind us all of what is at stake, that the United States does have an amazing role and responsibility in the international arena.
Patrick Cronin is Director of Research at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. An early look at the Bush foreign policy was the subject of today's Dateline. I'm Judith Latham. This is VOA.